It's great to be with you today, speaking remotely at a really interesting APAC innovation event. I'm Steve Wilson. I'm based in Sydney. I'm kind of in the theatre. I've been based working in Southeast Asia and North Asia since the 1990s. I was lucky to be sort of in the room when we started a lot of work at APAC on e-signature work and authentication. The authentication guide of APEX, I think, is still a really important resource in this space for setting the frame about the problem that we're trying to solve with authentication. I remember one of the world's first multifunction smart cards, Hong Kong in 2002, I believe, had a multifunction government-issued smart card co-branded with a bank, co-branded with a credit card brand, loaded up with apps for immigration, personal identity, KYC, bank account opening. Fabulous device, a little bit expensive, but incredibly powerful, and zero uptake. Hong Kong, of all places, one of the most digital countries you could imagine, worked for 10 years, and the only app for this multifunction smart card was for library borrowings. And it was the source of an amazing level of frustration for the government and for pundits and for advocates of technology like me. The lesson is that authentication in and of itself isn't an enabler, but uplifting from authentication to apps, to meaningful government service apps, e-business apps, is easier said than done. And I want to unpack some of those issues today, looking at the trends and the insights that we've had from the Asia theatre for 20 years, and to find out where we're at right now, give you some lessons and give you some ways to think about authentication and technology, the link between technology, business, and government. Identity. I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to say anything new about identity. I don't even want to use the word today. It's a really vexed topic. When we talk about government identity and digital identity, it's extraordinarily difficult in many parts of the world, especially Australia, United States, Great Britain, to have that discussion without getting stuck with national identity, government surveillance. It's a difficult issue and it needs to be unpacked. We do know that there's a number of objectives. These are almost like axioms. A lot of the identirati will take these things for granted. Sovereignty versus interoperability. Sovereignty, the right of a nation to deal with its citizens, to set standards, to set identification methods, is unquestioned. And yet we have that federation problem. We want to reuse identity data. We want to reuse credentials across border. How do you get that to interoperate without having some sort of master standard, which of course is impractical? Digital identity is really all about identifiers. And at one level, we've had digital identity for 50 years, ever since there was a social security number or a national ID. You know, pre-computerization, you can still think of these things as digital, insofar as they are digitizing the relationships that we have with people. So identifiers, indexes into databases, social security numbers, health identifiers, passport numbers, these things have been with us forever. When we digitized and when we got onto the internet, there's been a very, very strong temptation to, I think, anthropomorphize identifiers and to overreach, to pretend that your identifier is your digital identity. Identity is rich, it's relative, it's multifaceted. It's much more than just identifiers. Then there's a paradox that many identirati, many advocates in this space, of course, assume that we should have multiple identities. What they really mean is multiple identifiers. We really want to be able to keep our different walks of life separate. We want to index different databases differently so that nothing gets automatically mashed up. So the difference between identities and identifiers becomes really real. The controversial issue of anonymity online, I'm not going to take a position on that right now, but to acknowledge that the social policy and the human rights issues are super important. There are clearly times when absolute anonymity for whistleblowers and for advocates and for activists is an important thing. But how do we deal with this with technology? Technologists like to say that we should have anonymity, but we haven't really thought this through. So there's a lot of work to be done. technologically, from a privacy point of view, what we're really looking for is anti-correlation. We want to make sure that our different walks of life don't automatically get linked up with the adverse effects of surveillance and surveillance capitalism, of course. And I want to just leave you with the idea that, and this is going to get very technical very quickly, and I'm trying to avoid that, but authentication versus identification. In other words, how do you pick a unique person out of a crowd? That's one-to-N authentication. Or how do you know that it's the same person that you dealt with last time? One-to-one authentication. How do you make sure that the right person is in control of a device? How do you make sure that the right person is accessing a bank account? And how do you do that on a one-to-one basis? What's fascinating about FIDO, of course, is that it has really set the standards at all levels. It's set norms and habits and expectations that we should be using this technology to be unlocking devices one-to-one authentication and leaving identification and identity for other people to sort out at a policy level. So there's a really important demarcation in the FIDO world between the policy of identity and the mechanics and the technology of authentication. There's so much to talk about in identity. In a nutshell, we all agree that we want to know who we're dealing with online, and we want to foster, we technologists and policy people, we want to foster a genuine ecosystem. Many sources of truth, many issuers of identity information, issuers of credentials. There's lots of them. And there's also many verifiers. There's many relying parties that want to consume, ingest information about users. There are all sorts of carriers, data carriers, form factors. Smart devices are coming in the shape of wearables, digital passports, mobile phones, Internet of Things, a huge and increasing variety of form factors, and of course, standards. Standards for technology, standards for protocols, and standard ways of doing this stuff. One of the most important standards that we have goes back to the pre-internet days of plastic cards. We all carry dozens of plastic cards. Every plastic card basically works the same way. And from a human factors engineering point of view, that's really critical. We all pick up a card, we look at what it's for, whether it's for credit or employee or health or professions or driver's licensing. They're all different, and yet they all work the same way. So that societal standard, expecting technology to work the same way, is one of the unsung heroes, I think, of technology. It's something that we've lost track of most recently with digital technologies, but I think it's coming back. I think the mobile experience, making digital wallets and virtual credential holders consistent, is one of the forces of nature that's going to make all of this sort of stuff make sense. A genuine ecosystem has come around, and I talked about the user experience being consistent. The best example is mobile technology itself, mobility, and the expectation that users have of being able to present digital credentials in all sorts of ways. I think most of us are now using mobile phones, be it QR code or NFC, to board aeroplanes, mobile boarding passes. Fantastic. Of course, mobile payments. You can pay with your watch, you can pay with your phone, you can pay with your contactless credit cards. Open loop public transport ticketing in many countries of the world, moving from things like Octopus and Oyster dedicated stored value cards through to open loop credit card instruments working on your mobile phone. And where's this heading? I mean, we've got the supreme convenience now of being able to load a virtual hotel room key onto your mobile phone and to get in and out of your room with it. This is extraordinary innovation. When you think about this technology as carriers of data for different applications, context specific. How did we get to where we are today? How did we get to this situation of an ecosystem of innovative mobile credentials? You know, the origin story of credentials technology comes from 1955 and the diner's card, the paper diner's card that was agreed to by restaurants in New York City to extend credit to customers. We saw magnetic stripe technology come about in the 1970s. We saw magnetic stripe and holograms and security features in the 80s and 90s. Chip cards from the year 2000 onwards. Mobile phones, the smartphone, I mean, arguably BlackBerry claims the first smartphone probably in the year 2000, but I think most of us have been more familiar with the Samsung and Apple devices in the last 10 years. We can think about this technology and we can look at what's happening under the covers in terms of different maturity levels. I called it the foundation event. The origin of all of this stuff is actually not the technology of carrying numbers, but it's the business model of making sense of those numbers. There's a network business model at the heart of the credit card industry. It goes back 70 odd years, and it's about making sure that strangers can use a network to exchange verifiable numbers, credit card numbers. It's a powerful thing that we're beginning to see extrapolated. Automation with the magnetic stripe. The data in the magnetic stripe is the same as the data that's on the surface of that plastic, of the paper card. It's the same data being presented in an automatic way. Provenance. Data is data, but do you know that it's real? Do you know where it's come from? Do you know what the source of truth is? Do you know that the data is original and that it hasn't been copied and fallen into the wrong hands? So the provenance of the plastic card using hologram and that sort of technology. Digital provenance came with transaction signing. So I think level 4 of maturity came in the chip, in the original chip and PIN cards, and some of the cards that we've talked about around Asia, health cards and ID cards. And I want to say that what's happening with mobile technology broadly is intelligence. There's context awareness, there's situational awareness, there's a whole variety of signals that contribute to the security of a mobile device. The device itself is aware of its situation. It knows who it's talking to. It may know that it's fallen into the wrong hands. Now, the future, and we're beginning to see it now with things like Microsoft Azure Sphere, the future is IoT and it's agency. We're going from automation to full autonomy. Tens of billions of devices that are all, in fact, trying to identify themselves, authenticate themselves, exchanging data about themselves and their users. Verifiable credentials, a word about this, it is the most popular authentication subject of the day. Verifiable credentials is the idea that we will have digitized versions of things that have got provenance. You can present them with proof of possession so that you know that the data hasn't been replayed, and it's tamper resistant. The first verifiable credential was in fact the chip and PIN card, probably in the late 1990s. And we're updating this idea today. FIDO came along in 2013, and that's setting the standards for what I like to say consumerization of cryptography. FIDO leverages public key technology, private key, secure enclaves, transaction signing, a basket of technologies and tools are leveraged by FIDO to create strong authentication, phishing resistant, passwordless, intelligent authentication between registered devices and services. And FIDO, of course, works closely with W3C. It's the preferred way of publishing the open standards from FIDO. W3C also highly involved with verifiable credentials and updating what used to be a siloed, the idea of a verifiable credit card number is fine for credit cards, but how do you extrapolate? How do we have verifiable credentials that are more open and enabling that ecosystem of verifiers? And that's where the new verifiable credential standard comes in. It's a new paradigm shift. Let's look at government ID. Let's have a look at the difficulty that I mentioned that some countries have discussing and separating digital ID from government ID. Most countries are just getting on with it. Most countries don't see the sort of semantic problem that we have in Australia. 90% of countries around the world have a national ID today. Looking at the fabulous resource of the World Bank, publishes and tracks these statistics. In APAC, the figures are close to 100%. 16 out of 20 APAC economies, but that includes Russia, Chile, Peru, United States. Asia itself, fully 100% of South Asian nations have digital IDs and national IDs. 9 out of 10 ASEAN nations. The standouts, Canada, Australia, United States, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Philippines, Ireland, and a number of Pacific nations don't have national ID. Philippines is introducing. This is where things are difficult. All of these countries are in fact issuing or legislating special digital identity legislation. They're trying to lubricate authentication in the absence of a national ID, and it's proving to be really difficult. These things are easier said than done. Let's have a look at a selection of countries and how they're using authentication technology. We've got passive cards. If you have a national ID, then you've had a paper card or a plastic card, probably from birth. The smart card technologies are being selectively used and have done for 20 years in Asia. Smart card technologies is an update. Mobile ID, mobile identity technologies is where the action's at. I want to just select and skate over the use of these technologies across a number of economies of interest and to see whether or not we can draw any lessons from this. So Korea and Taiwan, national identity, yes. Passive plastic identity cards, yes. China has moved to a contactless smart card, a plastic card for its national ID. Japan has had a national ID for many years, and they've also been providing the option of what's now called My Number card to provide the option for citizens to take that identity technology, the national ID, and move it into a smart card of some sort. India, Aadhaar, an incredibly fascinating case study in itself, where one of the biggest nations in the world goes digital with a greenfield, and they are now taking their Aadhaar, which was started as a passive number printed on a piece of paper, digitizing it and mobilizing it into mobile apps, M-Aadhaar. Now, Germany, I want to say, many European nations, many European states have had an EID for a long time, but it's essentially an entry in a database. Germany is mobilizing, using mobile technology to take their EID, put it into a mobile phone. And Estonia, famously the most digital country on earth, moving also from their smart card, which they've had for 10 or 15 years, to a mobile form factor. United States, no national ID. Australia, no national ID. And yet these countries are not laggards. There are mobile driver's licenses in the United States and mobile driver's license standards across many of the 50 states. Australia doing a good job at government of digitizing credentials and using mobile technologies. Germany, I want to call out that they're using NFC technology and fully utilizing the user experience of mobile phones and mobile wallets to have a fast, secure, authenticated presentation of data on a contactless experience. And Estonia, voting, one of the few countries in the world that are really doing electronic voting, digital voting over the internet properly, leveraging the cryptography in their cards. I think that you need a full, authenticated, cryptographically sophisticated root of trust to be able to do internet voting, and Estonia is proving that, of course. So what are the global trends? What's the context for everything that we've talked about? The strongest trend I've talked about at FIDO Authenticate conferences now for a couple of years is the global trend from who to what. Who you are, identity, it's vague, it's organic, it's relative. What? Let's get precise. Digital is about precision. What are you? Are you a citizen of Korea? Are you a licensed driver? Are you over 21 years of age? The precise facts and figures that we need to know about people. This is the strongest trend. FIDO has been a huge part of this trend. FIDO at many levels has legitimized the transition from who to what. FIDO has prioritized authentication, one-to-one authentication over general purpose identification. The focus across the identity industry now, ironically, is not identity. The focus in my game is about attributes and relationships and how do you digitize those things and make them reliable online. Let's speak simply. It's about facts, about people, facts and figures. What's your citizenship? Have you got a COVID vaccination? How old are you? And indeed, it's about facts about devices. One of the beautiful things of FIDO is that it can allow a relying party or a verifier to know what sort of device is carrying that important data through over the network. So facts about people, facts about devices. In other words, it's about credentials, verifiable credentials. What's the pandemic meant for all of this? The pandemic has led to a mad rush, and I think many people find this a problematic rush to digitize not just vaccination information, but identity in general. So a very good social scientist at MIT has called this out and has been highly critical of a vendor-led rush to use the epidemic as an excuse to introduce digital identity processes where these things have not been called for before. In the middle of all of this, the World Health Organization has taken a long, hard look at how do you digitize vaccination certificates. And they have said long and hard and loud and clearly that vaccination, digital vaccination, is not an identity issue. And I want to emphasize this because it goes to that point about going from who to what. The guidelines issued by the WHO say that the vaccination certificate is not to be used as any sort of ID. And moreover, the digitized vaccination certificate should be issued without changing the identity protocols. It should leverage the existing healthcare processes that put jabs in arms and produces a digital fact about someone's vaccination certificate. I've been trying to say that identity is a special case of data. As we in this region become more and more digital, as we see more and more focus on supply chain and provenance and the analog to digital conversion, how do we trace, how do we make things visible online when the whole world is complicated and interconnected and messy? We have gone from identity through to attributes to verifiable credentials, and the Internet of Things demands identity of things. But to sort out this mess, we need verifiable information. We need to know data about those containers. We need to know data about ships. We need to know data about products. It needs to be verifiable. We need to know the source of data. We need to know it hasn't been tampered with. And we need to be able to track things across their life. We need context. We need signals, verifiable signals. We need cryptography, digital signatures, signing. And all of this is coming together under this basket of standards of FIDO. FIDO I see as being front and center in this transition through to the identity of things. Watch this space, folks. There's a lot of work to do, but the task ahead of us is simpler. And thanks again for listening to us today.